experiences. One of the things I've been doing quite a bit of writing on is an idea that I call strategic adaptation. Now, a lot of my work has been historical, less contemporarily focused, but I think we can learn a lot from historical cases. One of the groups I've studied is early feminists, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. These are women who, after they won voting rights, were trying to gain the right to sit on juries. And what I found as I studied these women and their activism, even though this was quite a while in the past, what I learned was that the more strategic these feminist groups were, the more likely they were to succeed in gaining this change in the law that they were working on. And also, the more likely they were to speed up the pace of that change they were seeking. So they got it more quickly. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about this idea of strategic adaptation. One thing that often happens when scholars like me and other folks study activists is we tend to pay a lot of attention to the environments that activists do their work in. So we look at the political context, the economic context even, the cultural context. Oftentimes we're not paying enough attention to the strategies, the tactics that activists engage in. And one of the things I noticed when I was studying these early feminist activists who were seeking to change the laws around juries was that when they engaged in this strategic orientation that I call strategic adaptation, is they were a lot more successful. So let me tell you a little bit about what strategic adaptation is, because perhaps it would be useful for you. I argue, and in fact, I've written a book about the women's jury movements. I argue in my book that strategic adaptation involves 4 steps. And I'm going to just quickly walk you through these 4 steps, but they don't have to be 4 steps that happen in a sequence. It could be that activists, as they engage in these 4 activities, they actually move back and forth between a couple of them. They may cycle back through all of them. So there's no set rule here about a sequence. But the 4 steps begin with, number 1, perceiving the world around you. So imagine you're sitting there talking with people you work with in your group, and oftentimes what we do is we focus on what we're doing, what our group is doing. But one of the things I noticed about the jury activists was that when the women in these groups were paying a lot of attention to what other people outside their groups were doing, including their opponents, including lawmakers who, had the ability to make the decision to change the law. When these activists were paying close attention to these other groups, and that's what I mean by perceiving signals, they learned a lot. And in particular, what they were learning is how they might think about their own tactics, their own strategies, in a way that would best respond to those other groups out there that oftentimes have a lot of power, the power to decide whether to make the change the activists want. So the first thing I argue is that perceiving these signals, the messages that are coming in from the broader environment, is really important. Opponents are saying things. People who are resisting the kinds of changes that activists want, those opponents have reasons that they're resisting. And if the activists can listen carefully to those opponents, they can think about how to respond in strategic ways to those opponents. If people who hold decision-making power are saying, well, we can't give the activists what they want because of reasons X, Y, and Z, if the activists clearly think about reasons X, Y, and Z, and say, well, wait a minute, we can respond to all of those reasons, and perhaps in ways that sort of set those reasons aside. If activists perceive those signals, listen to those messages very carefully. I argue that's the first step in being strategically adaptive. But there are 3 more steps, and I'm going to talk about these in a little bit less detail. The second step is for activists then to sort of sit back and say, okay, what are we doing right now? And should we make a decision to change our tactics based on these signals that we're hearing about? So this second step is about sort of self-reflection for the group, self-evaluation, and thinking about whether current tactics are the best means of seeking the change the group wants. Oftentimes, having a diverse group sitting around the table can really help with that kind of vetting of tactics. People with diverse backgrounds bring all kinds of diverse skill and knowledge to the table, and that's really important. Even if the group doesn't agree when they're evaluating the work they've been doing, the research suggests that's okay, because those kinds of tensions, disagreements can really fuel the sort of the deep evaluation that needs to go on. Sometimes we call this productive conflict, and that can be really important. So that's the second step, just evaluating one's existing tactics, the group's current tactics. So here's the third step. The third step is about deciding to change tactics. So this is closely linked to the evaluative step. But the group then needs to move beyond just evaluation and start making decisions about whether new tactics are needed. And this, of course, builds on the evaluation. But the group of activists may sit around and discuss and say, you know, we do need to change what we're doing. And as they go through this decision-making process of adapting their tactics, you know, they need to think hard about those signals they have been receiving. They need to think carefully about the evaluation of their tactics that they've done, and they need to make strategic choices about what tactics they think will best work. And, you know, I would argue at this point it's useful, it's very useful to think in terms of power struggles. Activists are often struggling over, you know, what the decision should be. About maybe, you know, how to change society or a local community in some way. And they're often, you know, trying to address people who have a lot of decision-making power. And the activist group would like to play a role in that decision-making in some fashion. Perhaps would just like to guide the direction of that decision. And there is a lot of theorizing in sociology and political science about power struggles. And what we know is that you can gain a lot of leverage in a struggle if you think about the struggle in 3 different ways. And I'm just going to mention this very quickly, but you can think about trying to persuade someone and what are the best arguments you can use to persuade someone. As you engage in a power struggle. You can also think about, this is the second way, you can also think about offering something in exchange. Is there something the other group wants? Can you offer it to them to get what you want? And the third thing you can think about in terms of a power relationship is, can you disrupt things? Can you be so disruptive in hopefully a non-violent way. I don't condone violence in any way, but can you be disruptive in a way that will get enough attention that people will feel compelled to respond to you? So as you think about tactics, you can draw on these power theorists and think about persuasion, exchange, and even disruption as tools to help you in your tactical deliberations. So anyway, I've talked about the first 3 steps in strategic adaptation: perceiving those signals, evaluating your actions, and then deciding to adapt your actions. There's one last step I want to mention, and I'll say this very briefly. Finally, you have to implement your new tactics, your new strategic orientation. This is the action step, and sometimes in the heat of a battle, when a group is thinking about lots of different issues, maybe they have to wait to implement the new tactic for the next legislative session, for example. Sometimes it's easy to lose sight of that actual action step. So that's just that fourth step in strategic adaptation is just that friendly reminder to get in there and implement the new tactic. So as you think about these 4 steps, perceiving, evaluating, adapting, and then implementing, these 4 steps around strategic adaptation, I think it's important to again realize it's a messy process. You might be going back and forth between a couple of those steps in a few times. You may circle back through when you realize your tactics aren't that effective. And that's fine. That's fine. But what my research has shown is that this kind of strategic adaptation can be very effective in helping activists succeed in gaining what they're seeking, and also speeding up that process of succeeding. So I want to wish you luck, and I hope you get what you desire. Thank you.